In the year 1021, 150 Norse warriors stood on North American soil 500 years before Columbus was even born. They possessed iron weapons, advanced sailing technology, and the combat experience of Europe's most feared raiders. Within 3 years, they would flee the continent forever, defeated by people they called Skrælings. 500 years before Columbus, Vikings had already invaded North America. This forgotten war would determine whether European colonization began in 1000 CE or 1492. By the end of this video, you'll understand why history's most feared warriors, the Vikings who terrorized all of Europe, were driven from North America by indigenous warriors they initially dismissed as primitives. I'm about to reveal 3 shocking truths: how a single escaped bull changed the course of world history, why Viking iron weapons and armor became their greatest weakness, and the tactical innovation that made indigenous warriors unbeatable. How could this happen? How could 150 battle-hardened Norse warriors be defeated by Stone Age technology? How could the first European Native American contact end so differently from all the others? Consider this. Thorvald Eriksson, brother of the legendary Leif Erikson, was killed by a weapon that shouldn't have been able to pierce Norse defenses. That single arrow would change the fate of 2 continents. The Vikings had conquered from England to Constantinople. They'd established kingdoms in Russia, Sicily, and Normandy. Their longships terrorized coastlines from Ireland to the Mediterranean. Yet here, on the shores of what they called Vinland, they met something they'd never encountered before, an enemy they couldn't defeat. What you're about to discover isn't just a battle. It's the moment when European expansion hit an immovable wall, when iron met stone, and stone won, when the unstoppable force of Viking ambition met the immovable object of indigenous resistance. To understand how the Vikings, Europe's most feared warriors, met their match, we need to go back to that first moment of contact. If you're fascinated by forgotten battles that changed the course of history, smash that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because what I'm about to reveal will completely change how you think about pre-Columbian America. Now, let me take you back to a frozen morning in 1021. The year 1000 marked the height of Viking expansion. From their Scandinavian homeland, Norse raiders had become Norse settlers, establishing kingdoms across Europe. They'd sailed rivers deep into Russia, served as the Byzantine emperor's personal guard, and discovered Iceland and Greenland. Now, they set their sights on lands even further west. Leading this new wave of exploration were the children of Eric the Red. First came Leif Erikson, who around the year 1000 discovered what he called Vinland, a land of wild grapes, endless timber, and rivers teeming with salmon. Then came his brother, Thorvald, the unlucky Eriksson, burning with ambition to establish a permanent Norse presence in this new world. The indigenous peoples the Vikings would encounter, likely Beothuk or Mi'kmaq nations, had called these lands home for thousands of years. The Norse called them Skrælings, a word that probably meant wretches or barbarians. This dismissive attitude would cost them dearly. But here's where it gets insane. Vinland wasn't some frozen wasteland. The medieval warm period had made the North Atlantic unusually navigable and the land unusually fertile. The Vikings found wild grapes growing impossible in modern Newfoundland. They found forests of towering trees perfect for shipbuilding, a resource desperately needed in deforested Greenland. They found meadows for grazing and waters full of fish larger than any in European waters. Lansor Meadows, discovered by archaeologists in 1960, proves this wasn't myth. Here stood Europe's first confirmed foothold in the Americas, workshops for iron smelting, longhouses for dozens of settlers, boat repair facilities. This wasn't a temporary camp. This was meant to be permanent. The power dynamics seemed clear. The Vikings brought iron broad axes that could fell trees in minutes, swords that could cleave through hide shields, metal arrowheads that could puncture any armor the indigenous peoples possessed. They brought chainmail that could turn aside stone weapons. They brought the military tactics that had conquered half of Europe. The indigenous peoples, by European standards, were Stone Age. Their arrows tipped with flint or bone, their boats made of skin, their armor made of hide. They had no horses, no metal weapons, no written military manuals. Yet within 3 years, the Vikings would abandon everything and flee. The primitives would teach the advanced Europeans a lesson in warfare they'd never forget. Because what happened next defied everything the Vikings knew about combat, conquest, and survival. But when these two worlds collided, nobody could have predicted what would happen next. The Norse expedition of 1021 represented the culmination of 20 years of exploration. This wasn't a raid, this was colonization. Among the 150 souls were warriors, certainly, but also women, children, and livestock. They brought cattle for milk and meat, sheep for wool, pigs for everything else. They brought the tools to recreate Norse society in a new land. Leading them was Thorfinn Karlsefni, the hopeful, a wealthy merchant from Iceland who had married Gudrid Thorbjarnadottir, widow of one of Leif Eriksson's brothers. With him came Thorvald Eiriksson himself, still seeking the glory that had eluded him in his brother's shadow. Their equipment represented the best of Viking Age technology: broad axes with meter-long hafts and triangular heads weighing 2.5 kilograms, devastating in combat, but also essential for clearing land. Pattern-welded swords, their steel folded dozens of times, creating blades that could bend without breaking. Round shields of linden wood, rimmed with iron. Most importantly, chainmail thousands of interlocking iron rings that could turn aside any cutting weapon. What happened next defied everything the Vikings knew about warfare. The indigenous forces remain harder to quantify, deliberately so. They didn't mass in great armies like European forces. They didn't announce their numbers with drums and horns. They used the forest itself as a weapon, appearing and disappearing like smoke. Their weapons, dismissed by the Vikings as primitive, were perfectly adapted to their environment. Arrows could be crafted quickly from local materials, no need for supply lines from Greenland. Their bows, made from flexible woods unknown in Europe, could drive those primitive arrows with surprising force. Their skin boats could navigate waters too shallow for Viking longships, allowing them to strike from unexpected directions. But hidden in their cargo was something that would doom them: all domesticated animals the indigenous peoples had never seen. Creatures that would seem like monsters from another world. Especially one bull, whose escape would spark a catastrophe. The first contact between Vikings and indigenous peoples had actually been peaceful. The sagas record trade red cloth exchanged for furs. The indigenous peoples were fascinated by the cloth's color, impossible to achieve with local dyes. The Vikings were impressed by the quality of the furs, superior to anything in European markets. Karlsefni, wise to the dangers of cultural misunderstanding, banned his people from trading weapons. He'd seen what happened when different cultures acquired each other's military technology. This prohibition would be respected until it wasn't. The geographic challenge facing the Vikings was immense. Unlike Europe, where rivers led to towns and roads connected settlements, Vinland was wilderness. Every expedition inland meant entering an environment where their enemies knew every tree, every stream, every hiding place. Where heavy armor became a liability rather than an asset. Where their tactical superiority, the shield wall, the coordinated charge, meant nothing if you couldn't force your enemy to stand and fight. Then came the morning that would spiral into 3 years of bloodshed. Thorvald Eiriksson led 9 men on an exploration up the coast. They found 9 indigenous men sleeping under their overturned skin boats on a beach. What followed wasn't exploration. It wasn't even combat. It was murder. 8 died without waking. Norse axes split skulls and severed spines before any alarm could be raised. But the 9th, that single survivor, would cost them everything. He escaped into the forest, carrying news of unprovoked slaughter. The Vikings had committed their first fatal error. They'd assumed that superior weapons meant superior position. They'd assumed that indigenous peoples would react like Europeans, with attempts at negotiation, with formal challenges, with predictable responses. They were wrong. Dead wrong. Then came the morning that would spiral into 3 years of bloodshed. Dawn mist clung to the beach as Thorvald's party discovered the overturned boats. 9 men lay sleeping beneath them, unaware that death stood over them with iron axes. Thorvald made the decision that would doom Norse America attack, without warning, without provocation, without mercy. The massacre took less than 2 minutes. Viking axes, designed to split shields and mail, made quick work of unarmored men. Blood soaked into sand. 8 bodies lay still. But that 9th man, he rolled away from a killing blow, scrambled to his feet, and vanished into the tree line before pursuing Vikings could catch him. No matter, Thorvald reportedly said. One savage can't stand against Norse iron. That single survivor would cost them everything. 3 days passed in false calm. The Vikings returned to their base, boasting of their easy victory. They'd proven Norse superiority. They'd sent a message. What message? That Europeans would kill without cause, strike without warning, murder men in their sleep. On the 4th dawn, the indigenous response arrived. Thorvald was inspecting the boat repairs when the first scout ran into camp. "The forests are moving," he gasped. From the tree line emerged warriors, dozens, then scores. They moved in coordinated groups, spreading out to surround the Viking position. "Shield wall!" Thorvald bellowed. His men scrambled for weapons, forming their traditional defensive formation. But these enemies didn't charge like European warriors. They stopped just outside sword range and unleashed their response. The air filled with death. Arrows whistled through the morning air, not the scattered shots Vikings expected from primitives, but coordinated volleys. Stone and bone tips shattered against shields and mail, but the sheer volume was overwhelming. Vikings crouched behind their shields as arrows struck like hail. "To the boats!" Thorvald ordered a fighting retreat to their ships, where the hulls could provide additional cover. His men backed toward the water, shields locked, as arrows continued to rain down. They made it to the longships and turned them sideways, creating a wooden wall. For hours, the arrow storm continued. Vikings huddled behind their fortifications, occasionally loosing arrows of their own, but their enemies were shadows in the forest, impossible to target. Then, during a brief lull, Thorvald peered between his shield and the ship's rail to assess their situation. A single arrow threaded the gap. The shaft, no thicker than a man's thumb, tipped with sharpened stone, found the few inches of exposed flesh between Thorvald's armor and shield. It pierced deep into his armpit, puncturing his lung. But the arrow that killed him defied all Viking military experience. Stone shouldn't have penetrated so deep. The angle shouldn't have been possible. The timing, exactly when he exposed himself, suggested patient, skilled marksmanship beyond anything they'd encountered in European warfare. Thorvald looked at the shaft protruding from his body with genuine surprise. "I have gotten a good land in my grasp," he gasped, blood frothing his words, "though I shall hardly enjoy it." His men gathered around as their leader brother, of the famous Leif, son of Eric the Red, died on a nameless beach thousands of miles from home. They buried him at a place called Crossness, with wooden crosses at his head and feet as he'd requested. The first Viking grave in North America. The first proof that iron armor couldn't guarantee victory. The first warning that should have been heeded. But here's where it gets even more insane. The Indigenous warriors didn't press their advantage. They melted back into the forest, their point made. This wasn't random violence. This was calculated response. They'd shown they could kill Viking leaders. They'd demonstrated their tactical superiority in their own terrain. They'd given the invaders a chance to leave. The Vikings didn't take it. They saw Thorvald's death as demanding vengeance, not wisdom. They prepared for war against an enemy they still didn't understand. An enemy that had just shown them exactly how this war would be fought, on Indigenous terms, with Indigenous tactics, with Indigenous victories. The pattern was now established. Vikings would try to impose European-style warfare shield walls, armor, fixed positions. Indigenous warriors would respond with fluid tactics, mobility, range, terrain advantage. Every Viking strength would become a weakness. Every piece of iron armor would become a burden in pursuit. Every fixed fortification would become a trap. And this was only the beginning. What happened next would show the Vikings they had gravely underestimated their enemy. Dawn broke over the settlement at Stromfjord. The Vikings had survived winter, established their base, and begun to believe they could make this work despite Thorvald's death. Then chaos erupted from their own camp. The bull, a massive beast, brought for breeding stock, had broken free from its pen. Bellowing with rage or fear, it charged through the settlement and into the forest. Vikings scrambled after it, knowing they couldn't afford to lose such valuable livestock. What happened next changed everything. A group of Indigenous traders had approached the settlement for their regular exchange. They'd never seen a domesticated bull. To them, this was a monster, a roaring demon with horns charging directly at them. The warriors scattered in terror. Some ran, some froze. The bull, probably just seeking freedom, charged through their group and disappeared into the woods. But to the Indigenous peoples, this looked like an attack, a Norse war beast set loose upon them. In the confusion, with Vikings chasing the bull and Indigenous warriors defending against what they thought was an assault, violence erupted. 2 Vikings, isolated from their companions, were cut down by arrows. Their bodies weren't recovered until the next day. How could a farm animal spark a war? Because neither side understood what the other was thinking. The Vikings saw a valuable animal escaping. The Indigenous peoples saw a weapon they couldn't comprehend. Both sides saw the other's response as aggression. The trading stopped. The fragile peace shattered. And both sides prepared for what came next. Months passed in tense standoff. Then Karlsefni made a decision that revealed the true nature of Viking intentions. They would capture indigenous people to bring back to European slave markets. The plan was simple: ambush a trading party, overwhelm them with iron weapons, and sail away with human cargo worth fortunes in Norway. The Vikings prepared carefully. They identified a group that came to trade at a specific inlet. They positioned their forces. When the skin boats appeared, they attacked. It was a disaster. The ambush found nothing but empty boats' decoys. The real warriors emerged from concealment on the heights above the inlet. The Vikings, caught in the open, faced a storm of arrows unlike anything in European warfare. More arrows than at Stamford Bridge, one survivor later recalled, referencing the famous battle in England. But at Stamford Bridge, you could see your enemies, charge them, bring iron to bear. Here, enemies were shadows among trees, raining death from above. The Vikings fled to their ships under constant fire. Men fell with arrows in their backs, the ultimate dishonor in Norse culture. They barely made it to their boats, shields bristling with shafts like porcupines. The kidnapping plot died on that beach, along with any Viking illusion of easy conquest. By the second winter, both sides were exhausted. Trade tentatively resumed at a new settlement called Hop, further south, where the climate was milder. Vikings needed furs for the cold. Indigenous peoples had developed a taste for milk products, something that would later have devastating consequences when European diseases arrived, but for now seemed harmless. The peace was fragile but holding. Then, one of Karlsefni's men noticed his axe head was missing. These weren't simple tools. Norse axes were valuable, often decorated, sometimes passed down through generations. He accused an indigenous trader of theft. What followed revealed the fatal flaw in Viking justice. No investigation, no attempt to search, no consideration that the axe might simply be misplaced. The accused man was seized and killed on the spot, executed for a crime that was never proven. This murder would seal the fate of Norse America. The indigenous peoples had tolerated unprovoked attack. They'd endured the bull incident. They'd defended against enslavement attempts. But the execution of an innocent man under the guise of justice, this demanded response. 3 days later, that response arrived. The horizon filled with boats. Not the handful of trading vessels the Vikings expected, but a flotilla. Skin boats beyond counting, approaching from multiple directions. The Vikings scrambled to defensive positions, but their settlement at Hop was designed for living, not siege defense. Then, the indigenous warriors unveiled their secret weapon. Not a new technology, but a new tactical approach. They didn't mass for assault against Viking shields. They maintained distance, using coordinated arrow fire to pin defenders, while other groups moved to flanking positions. The Vikings tried their traditional tactics. Shield wall formations meant nothing when enemies wouldn't close to sword range. Cavalry charges. They had brought horses founded in forests, where riders couldn't see threats until too late. Heavy armor that dominated European battlefields became a death trap when pursuing enemies who could run for hours. What followed wasn't a battle. It was a masterclass in asymmetric warfare. Indigenous warriors used tactics that wouldn't be seen in European conflicts for centuries. Fire arrows at night, not aimed at Vikings, but at their psychological stability. Random attacks denying sleep, wearing down morale. Supply raids targeting Viking food stores, forcing them to forage in hostile territory. Feigned retreats drawing armored Vikings into exhausting pursuits, then ambushing the scattered, exhausted survivors. The Vikings realized they were being slowly strangled. Every sortie cost them men they couldn't replace. Every day brought new tactics they couldn't counter. Their iron weapons meant nothing if they couldn't bring them to bear. The indigenous tactical innovation was simple but revolutionary. Deny the enemy their strengths. Viking military doctrine depended on several factors, all of which were systematically negated. Close combat where iron weapons dominated. Never engage at sword range. Fixed battles where discipline mattered. Fight fluid engagements where terrain knowledge trumped formation. Armor advantage? Make them pursue until that armor became a fatal burden. Psychological warfare through berserker charges? Counter with your own psychological operations. Ghost warriors who struck and vanished. One saga records a telling incident. A group of Vikings, pursuing raiders who had struck their cattle, chased them into the forest. The indigenous warriors maintained just enough distance to stay visible, but out of reach. For hours, the chase continued. Finally, exhausted Vikings in 20-kilogram chainmail collapsed. The warriors they'd been chasing turned back and killed them at leisure with stones and clubs, iron armor useless against blunt trauma. 0 major Viking victories were recorded in 3 years of conflict. Think about that. The same warriors who conquered kingdoms from Ireland to Russia couldn't win a single decisive engagement against Stone Age primitives. But the numbers hide the real story. This wasn't just military defeat, it was psychological catastrophe. Vikings defined themselves through victory, through conquest, through imposing their will on others. Here, every strength became weakness. Every tactic failed. Every assumption proved wrong. The settlement became a prison. Women couldn't gather food without armed escort. Children couldn't play outside the walls. The cattle that hadn't been killed were slowly starving because grazing meant vulnerability. The dream of Vinland turned into a nightmare of constant vigilance, sleepless nights, and the growing certainty that they were losing. Year 3 arrived with the settlement barely functioning. Karlsefni held a council. They had 2 options: abandon Vinland or die in it. Some warriors, clinging to honor, argued for fighting to the death. But the women, including Karlsefni's pregnant wife, Gudrid, provided the voice of reason. What honor was there in letting children die for pride? The final Norse council in North America was bitter. They'd come as conquerors and were leaving as refugees. They'd planned to establish a kingdom and were fleeing with whatever they could carry. They dreamed of saga-worthy victories and found only defeat. As the Vikings prepared to flee the continent they'd tried to conquer, the true cost became clear. This wasn't just a failed settlement. This was the end of westward Viking expansion. The same people who'd made Europe tremble were themselves fleeing in fear. And this was only the beginning of the historical impact. The retreat from Vinland was chaos, wrapped in desperation. Vikings loaded their ships with frantic energy, abandoning anything that couldn't fit. 3 years of construction, cultivation, and dreams left behind in hours. The buildings at Lansaw Meadows workshops that had smelted bog iron, longhouses that had sheltered families, storage buildings filled with supplies, all abandoned to the elements. Indigenous warriors maintained pressure until the end. Arrows whistled from the tree line as Vikings carried supplies to their ships. No massive final assault, that wasn't their way. Just constant reminder that leaving was the only option that didn't end in death. The loading revealed the expedition's transformation. They'd arrived with cattle, sheep, pigs, horses, the foundation of a permanent settlement. They left with whatever livestock had survived, many animals killed by raiders or starvation. They'd come with plans for expansion. They left hoping just to reach Greenland alive. Gudrid, now mother to Snorri Thorfinnsson, the first European born in the Americas, clutched her infant as their ship pushed off. Around her, wounded men groaned from arrow wounds that festered without proper treatment. The sight of North America fading behind them brought not sadness, but relief. But the numbers hide the real story. The sagas record at least 8 Vikings killed, starting with Thorvald. Indigenous casualties went unrecorded by Norse sources, but archaeological evidence suggests significant losses on both sides. Yet casualty figures miss the true impact. This was complete strategic defeat. The Vikings hadn't lost a battle, they'd lost a war. They hadn't failed to take a city, they'd failed to establish any permanent presence. They hadn't negotiated a retreat, they'd fled. The psychological impact shattered Viking confidence. These were people who'd conquered wherever they'd sailed. Their self-image depended on being unstoppable raiders, inevitable conquerors. In Vinland, they'd met their match and more. The journey home took weeks of North Atlantic sailing. Ships that had left Greenland filled with hope returned carrying defeat. Karlsefni, the merchant who'd invested everything in this venture, spent the voyage calculating losses, not just in goods but in reputation. When they reached Greenland, then Iceland, the stories spread quickly. The official sagas would emphasize Norse bravery, minimize the defeat, blame bad luck. But the truth traveled in whispers. Vinland was death. The Skrælings were unbeatable. Stay away. History pivoted on indigenous arrows. Consider the alternative timeline. Vikings establish permanent settlement. European diseases arrive 500 years early. Indigenous peoples face apocalyptic plague without 5 centuries to develop larger populations. European colonization begins in 1000, not 1492. Instead, indigenous victory created a 500-year barrier. Europe forgot about Western lands. Maps labeled them as mythology. When Columbus discovered America, he found continents with millions of inhabitants, complex civilizations, vast cities. Those civilizations existed because Vikings failed. The immediate aftermath in North America saw indigenous peoples reclaim their coastlines. The abandoned Norse buildings became sources of valuable iron nails carefully extracted, tools repurposed. Within decades, nature reclaimed the settlements. Within centuries, even oral traditions faded to legend. For the Norse, consequences were immediate and lasting. No major expedition returned to Vinland. A few small ventures possibly harvested timber, but always quick raids, never settlement. The western route was closed, declared unprofitable and unsurvivable. Gudrid's son, Snorri, that first European American, grew up in Iceland hearing stories of his birthplace. He never returned. No one did. His unique status, born in a land his people couldn't conquer, symbolized the entire failed venture. The personal aftermath haunted survivors. Warriors who'd fled rather than died faced social stigma. Karlsefni's reputation recovered through careful saga management, but privately, he'd led the retreat. He'd ordered the abandonment. He'd chosen survival over glory. Indigenous oral traditions, where they survived later epidemics, told different stories. Stories of victory against invaders, stories of successful defense, stories of warriors who used intelligence and knowledge to defeat brute force. These stories sustained resistance mindsets through later, darker chapters. But this 3-year war would echo across 5 centuries. The Viking failure at Vinland created a 500-year pause in European expansion history's most consequential delay. When Europeans finally returned in 1492, they found not scattered tribes, but continental civilizations. The Aztec Empire at its height, the Inca controlling thousands of miles of territory, the Mississippian culture building cities that rivaled European capitals. Those 5 centuries mattered. Indigenous populations had time to grow, develop, create. When European diseases finally arrived, they struck populations in the millions, not thousands. Devastating, yes, but not the complete extinction that might have occurred in 1021. Modern archaeology confirms what the sagas hinted at. In 2023, a nature study definitively dated Lenceau Meadows to 1021 CE, using tree ring analysis and cosmic ray events. This wasn't myth or exaggeration. Europeans really did try to colonize North America 500 years before Columbus, and they really did fail. That failure established patterns that would replay throughout history. European technological superiority assumed, but not guaranteed. Indigenous tactical innovation underestimated at European peril. The danger of applying conventional warfare to unconventional enemies. Terrain advantage trumping weapons advantage. What makes a superior civilization? Vikings had iron, ocean-crossing ships, written language, centralized military organization. Indigenous peoples had none of these, yet won decisively. They possessed something more valuable: perfect adaptation to their environment, tactical flexibility, and unified purpose in defending their homeland. The myth of inevitable European dominance dies in Vinland. If Vikings, Europe's apex predators, could be defeated by stone weapons and superior tactics, then technological determinism fails. History isn't about superior civilizations replacing inferior ones. It's about adaptation, tactics, and will. Modern military thinkers study asymmetric warfare in Afghanistan, Vietnam, and other conflicts where technological superiority failed. The principles aren't new. Indigenous North Americans wrote the textbook in 1021, mobility over armor, knowledge over strength, patience over aggression. Sometimes the most advanced technology is knowing every stream and hill. Sometimes the greatest weapon is making your enemy fight on your terms. Sometimes victory comes not from having iron, but from making iron irrelevant. 150 Vikings with iron weapons fled from warriors with stone arrows. Not because stone beats iron in direct confrontation, but because the warriors wielding stone understood something the Vikings didn't. Wars aren't won by weapons, but by wisdom. The First European-American War ended with European retreat. Complete, humiliating, permanent retreat. History's most feared raiders found something to fear, an enemy that wouldn't fight by their rules, couldn't be intimidated by their reputation, and knew exactly how to turn every Viking strength into weakness. When we talk about pre-Columbian America, we often imagine isolated peoples unprepared for European contact. Vinland proves otherwise. When contact came, indigenous peoples responded with sophisticated military strategy, coordinated resistance, and tactical innovation. They weren't passive victims of history. They were active agents who shaped it. The Viking saga in North America ends not with conquest but with a question. What if they had succeeded? What different world would we inhabit if European colonization had begun 5 centuries earlier? We'll never know, because when iron met stone on North American shores, stone won. And for 500 years, Europe would remember that lesson and stay away.